Welcome to Another Dose, the GEMS podcast where EMS meets ED to talk about trending topics in emergency medical services. I'm Dr. Candace McDonald.
Hi, I'm Robin Goldinger, and today's show is focused on the pros and cons of social media among EMS and ED providers.
We know that social media can be used for the good, such as to aid in recruitment and retention efforts, building relationships with stakeholders, engaging our employees for educational purposes, for professional networking. It also can allow for communication during disasters. There's a lot of good that can come out of social media.
On the flip side, we see many professionals crossing the ethical and policy boundaries on social media, which has cost some of them their jobs. I've witnessed it myself. Some of the negative behaviors we have seen include HIPAA violations, which can not only cost somebody their job, but it can cost the organization some fines, and it's not a good thing. There's bullying, there's hate speech, negative talk about the employer with comments, and the list goes on and on.
So it's important that we look at this topic. It's important, to look at how we use social media for the good and the bad. So let's take a look at the research. What we know is that one study showed that participants of the study, they actually stated that they check their phone an average of 85 times a day. 85 times a day, they're checking their phone, checking their social media accounts. And they said that they spend about 5 hours a day using their smartphone. That's a lot of time. And a lot of that happens on the job. We know that. We also know that government agencies are increasingly using social media to engage with their citizens, to share information, to deliver services more quickly, and to really connect with the community. We also know that social media usage is one of the most popular online activities. In 2020, it was estimated that 3.6 billion people were using social media worldwide. That's a lot of people. And they actually project that that number will increase to almost 4.41 billion in 2025. There was also another study that looked at tracking social media adoption. And in 2005, they said that just 5% of American adults were using one platform. By 2011, that actually jumped up to half of all of Americans using social media. Today, 72% of the public in America uses some type of social media. So we went from 2005 to where we're at 5% to today, where we're at like 72%. So that's really jumped up. When we look at the demographics of who's using social media, it's not just the young kids, it spreads all across. We know that in the 18 to 29-year-old population, 90% of that group is using social media. The 30 to 49 age category, 82%. And as we creep up to the 50 to 64 age group, 69%, and those 65 and over are at 40% usage. So, everybody of every age is on social media. I know my 80-year-old grandma, she uses it, and she uses it quite well. She's done a really great job of adapting. But we also know that with social media, that it's important that we look at the content we're sharing. And if we're sharing it from a government agency or an EMS organization, we need to make sure that we're looking at being ADA compliant, because we want to make sure that the platforms and the messages that we're sharing are accessible to all citizens, including those with disabilities. Digital.gov is a great resource for ensuring that ADA compliance is met when it comes to social media.
So let's go ahead and talk about the pros and cons.
All right. So when I look at social media and the pros and cons, I kind of look at my history on social media, and I have to laugh because I had this big policy, and I think I shared this when I was at EMS today with Matt and with Rich, and I had this policy of no pictures of alcohol on my social media. Well, then COVID hit, and I think I lost my mind. And then I remember I said, I just shared an alcoholic beverage on social media. That's something I never do. So, we've definitely seen a change with COVID when it comes to the social media. The usage of TikTok has kind of jumped up, and people have gotten in a lot of trouble for some of the things that they've been posting during these times. So we definitely want to take a look at the pros and cons, how we can use it for the good, the bad. And so with us today, we have three very great people. Not only are our guests part of the EMS system, but they actually bring additional expertise to add to our conversation. We actually have two attorneys and an amazing journalist and assistant professor with us today. So first up, we have my dear friend and fire chief, Chip Comstock. So Chip, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So Chip, you want to share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Started off in a private fire company in upstate New York in 1982 and continued with that through law school when I was with Upper Arlington as a volunteer outside of Columbus. After graduation, moved back to the Youngstown area where I grew up and served in a township department as a volunteer. It was a combination department. And then since 1992, I've served in Western Reserve Joint Fire District in Poland, Ohio, and have served as a chief since 1998. And we're a all volunteer organization that serves a population of about 15,000 people. We run about 12 to 1,300 calls a year and provide ALS, first response and transport. On the law side, I've been practicing law since 1988 and provide a lot of advice to fire departments, firefighters, fire chiefs, and we're having this podcast because social media is one of the big issues that gets addressed, in the law practice and throughout the fire and EMS services.
So Chip, can you talk about that? Can you talk about some of the good and the ugly that you're seeing out there that keeps you employed and keeps probably Matt employed as well?
I think the good, you've really touched on it. I think fire departments are realizing it's a way to gather public support, using it positively to get people to support our mission, find out what we're doing, and connect with not only, the citizens, but particularly those younger users that are out there that we're trying to attract. So, and some of it, I think for us, the challenge is trying to keep up with the trends of the younger population. The ugly, and I have to watch what I say because some of this is information dealing with clients. But yesterday and today, I've been dealing with a social media issue that dealt with somebody posting pictures on a private chat room that they probably should not have, and has got back to the department, and the department's trying to deal with this stuff. And there are things in those pictures that would tie that person to the department that you just, it's not something you would be permitted or would normally want to put out on Facebook or some other more public site. So it's called employment death or by social media, or employment suicide by social media, because people put things out there. You've talked about hate speech and all those other things that they do without thinking, and that's it becomes a real issue, and it repeats itself on a weekly, if not daily basis.
Yeah, and we know that with those platforms, with that social media, those platforms, we know that nothing is private. So many people think, oh, well, I have a private social media setting. I'm only sharing it with this group, but people screenshot and they share things, and that information gets out there and it becomes viral.
You can share it with one person, and that becomes a whole nother thing we can talk about later. But what happens when you send that one picture to that one friend that you thought would remain private? And because of a breakdown of relationship, because of a revenge issue, because of whatever else, that person now takes that photograph, that statement, that thing that you confided in confidence and wrote about the chief or the director or somebody else that you thought would never get out, and now it's all over social media. So whenever you commit something to an electronic media, nothing is safe.
Yeah, and those things go viral so quick. It's amazing, one little video, one little TikTok, one little Facebook page post, and it becomes viral. I know, I made a TikTok video of my husband when he was released from the hospital from COVID, and it ended up Rich in New Jersey. He saw it. And so that video has been, viewed over 300,000 times. So it's like crazy that some little, video that I posted here in Ohio is just kind of blown up across the country. So something, it just spreads.
It's both, again, it's positive and negative. We rescued a couple weeks ago an iguana out of a tree, and that made the news in Chicago, from Ohio. So it was really great. Just like you said, it's wonderful. But when it's something's negative, it's going to hit the national news just as much, and sometimes it'll spread even more. And the problem is with social media, you can't undo what's been done.
Absolutely. I saw a post on Facebook from a mom whose child had drowned on a family vacation, and we're looking for the firefighter medic who saved their son's life, and it ended up being a firefighter from Warren, Ohio, and through social media, because, hey, do you know this person? Do you know that person? Hey, reach out to them. They were able to find him and like see him and thank him. And, you know, positive things can come out of it too. But with that being said, are EMS professionals protected by the First Amendment on social media, or is that a no-go? You knew I was going to ask it, right?
Candace has taught, we've taught a couple classes together, and one of the areas I've written on more than any other for various magazines and providers is the implication of the First Amendment for employee speech. And the answer is it's not that simple. And if it was really simple, we wouldn't have all these courts and all these lawsuits, because everybody would know what the answer is. And I'm going to run through a 2-minute quick version of the First Amendment, and then if you have any follow-ups, I'll try to hit that. But you know, first issue always is the First Amendment, all the constitutional provisions, you know, in terms of illegal search and seizure and right to bear arms. The constitutional amendments protect us against the government. So when we talk about free speech or First Amendment rights, you know, the right to press, association, to talk, that protects us against action by the government. So if you're working for a private provider and you or you're working for, you know, for McDonald's or Walmart, and you stand outside as an employee with a sign that says, "This place sucks," you might not have a job very long. But if you stand outside a governmental structure, you're out in front of City Hall with a similar sign, and they tried to fire you from your job, you may have First Amendment protection. So I start off when saying, do you have First Amendment protection or not? One of the misconceptions out in the public is that somebody says something via social media or in any other form. And I should also add that, you know, the First Amendment arises in any case where you're expressing yourself. And that could be, you know, in an email, it could be on Facebook or social media, but it can also be on a t-shirt, a bumper sticker, a button. You know, it applies in all these different circumstances. Now, I recognize we're talking about social media today, but again, First Amendment it applies whenever you're expressing yourself. People out there believe that they can say whatever they want, and then he's setting into protected from the First Amendment. Again, it's only we're talking about employees. It's if your employer is a governmental entity or quasi-governmental entity, because some private EMS, some private fire companies have been treated as governmental entities. But so that's the first issue. And then the courts are going to look at to determine whether you have First Amendment protection. Are you speaking as an employee or as a citizen? So if speaking is part of your job duties, if you're the chief and I'm out there in the public and I talk all the time on behalf of the fire department, it's less likely that my speech is going to be perceived as being, you know, as a private citizen as opposed to employee. And if that speech arises as part of my job duties, the courts are typically going to stay out of that dispute and say, listen, this person was speaking as employee, this is employment matter, we're not going to talk about it. On the other hand, if I'm talking about something that is a matter of that any citizen might, I'm out in front of the City Hall and I'm talking about or protesting issues about abortion or cuts in some funding, or, you know, it's an issue of Black Lives Matter, those type of things that really hit home in terms of the right of a citizen to protest or speak. The courts are going to be more likely to give First Amendment protection to that public speech, which generally addresses social, economic, political issues, as opposed to an employment matter. You know, I don't happy that I have to work, I have forced overtime. If you're protesting or writing about something that's really focused on your own employment, you're not likely to have First Amendment protections. Now, even if here's the tough part. Even if you're speaking as a matter of on public concern as a citizen, if you put something out there that causes problems with the department, it causes a backlash from the public, it creates controversy or turmoil within the department, it affects the functions of the fire department or EMS department, the courts apply a balancing test, because we have the two great conflicts here are the employee's right to speak as a citizen versus the employer's right to maintain discipline within the fire department or EMS department. So if those two are conflicting, the courts are going to do this balancing test and see, has there been harm done by the employee's speech? And if the court finds that there's been harm done by the employee's speech, that employee may not have First Amendment protection. And the real problem is this: until that employee speaks and puts that out, whatever it is, on social media, you don't know whether there's going to be harm or backlash as a result of that speech. So there was a captain down in Miami, Florida, who wrote about the Trayvon Martin case and talked about the ignorant parents and in the urban areas and all the things that they shouldn't have done. When he wrote that to a small group of friends, nobody had an idea he didn't know it was going to be screenshot. He didn't know that was going to get out and somebody else was going to put on social media. It was going to be shared, and it created a real storm within that community. At the time you're hitting post, you don't know what the results are going to be. And if an employee, a public employee, puts something on social media and it creates problems, chances are the courts are not going to support that speech, even if it was made as a citizen on a matter of public concern. So that's the thing. Anytime a public employee puts something out there, he or she is rolling the dice to see what the end result might be. And that's my caution to employees is, you better be darn certain when you put something on social media that it's not going to come back to haunt you, because you, at the end of the day, it's more likely than not, you won't have any First Amendment protections.
Wow, thank you. I wasn't aware of all of that. Lots of good information. We're going to go ahead and move to our next guest, attorney paramedic Matt Strieger. In addition to having over 30 years in practicing law, Matt has experience in the EMS system in a number of different states. He has contributed to a number of articles and has been a speaker at numerous conferences, and we are super excited and very honored to have him here today.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks, Candace. I appreciate you having me on.
Super. Well, thank you. As an attorney and a leader, what are your concerns with the use of social media?
So it's interesting because I want to echo everything Chip just said, because he just did probably one of the best First Amendment analyses I've ever heard somebody do. All of these things come down to the difference between an individual's use of social media and an organization's use of social media. And as we look at these things, I think we have to look at the pitfalls to both of them for where we have problems with agencies using it versus where we have problems with individuals using it. They aim for different places and they end up with different pitfalls because of that. Both of them, the biggest pitfall is posting about calls. If you post stuff about what goes on in a job, you get jammed up. There's just never, ever, ever a reason to do that. And I've gotten in arguments and in pretty heated disputes with people about this. Do you post videos? Do you post stories about people posting on Facebook or other places about jobs that you did? And I just don't think there's a place for it in social media. Even if you're doing public awareness from that, you're posting about somebody's worst day ever. And I respect the need of people to get involved and to tell you what you do. There are ways to do that without even improving your social media presence, which is what you're trying to do with that. And there's a community service to do that. You're profiting even intangibly by improving your organization's visibility by somebody's worst day. And I just don't think there's a place to do that. In medicine, it's do no harm. So I'm just never a fan of doing that. There's also the operational security issues associated with that too. There's HIPAA issues, there's OPSEC issues. You just don't want to give up the stories of what you're doing because they're never good for that. Does that answer your question?
It does, absolutely. And I've had to talk to some of my ER nurses. You know, we all go on social media and kind of vent like, oh, it was the worst shift ever. I had 2 full arrests and a semi and a stroke and this trauma and that trauma. And I'm like, you guys, you can't put that on there. Like, we're the only hospital in our county. People know these people.
And people don't interpret things the same way. I mean, we in EMS have a bit of a gallows humor. We have somewhat black humor. You know, we're a little off sometimes. Everybody who does this has got a little time that we've, had that moment of dark humor. There was somebody recently who lost their job because they were posting like, God, it is just so freaking quiet here in the ICU tonight. I'd give anything for a full arrest. And somebody looked at it and they're like, yeah, I get what you're saying, but wishing somebody to die so you can have some excitement doesn't have exactly the best public image. It's not exactly how you want to put that stuff. And it's so easy, Robin, as you noted, you're the only ER in your county. So when something happens, there's a famous story of somebody who got jammed up with a police involved shooting. And they were like, a police officer was shot and they were killed, or they were critically injured, and pray for this person because they have these injuries. And you put the information together here to the information together here, congratulations, you have a privacy breach. And even if it's not a HIPAA violation, which it probably is, it certainly violates the canons of good privacy and good act. And it could be an actionable case depending on whether the person's damaged from it. So at the end of the day, I just don't like doing any of that. I just don't have a place for that. There's plenty of wonderful ways to use social media to recruit, to find positive ways of looking at what your organization did. I'll tell a great story, and I don't want to name the organization because it's not been made public, but my 11-year-old son got to do a Stop the Bleed class at a department recently. And they're saving that social media for the right time to talk about it, because how often you get to put an 11-year-old kid through a social media through a Stop the Bleed class? Like, that's a really cool thing when you want to tell people what you're doing. There's great opportunities to do things like that don't involve talking about your patients, don't involve talking about it. My comment for this from the patient, from the provider side, and I'm still an active provider, I still ride the ambulance, is not to take your phone out and don't be playing with it when you're on a call, unless there's a work-related reason to do it. But this is the coolest thing in the world, and it has the world's information on it. And I take my phone out on jobs and I'm like, hey, I don't know what that medicine is, or I'm new here and I forgot what the STEMI hospitals are for this area. Like, there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with your phone. One of them is not checking Facebook, and one of them is not taking pictures of your patients or pictures of what happened on calls. Just the moment you do that, it lives forever. And there's that one thing in the background, or there's the moment your patch is visible and they can tell what agency you came from. You think you can anonymize this stuff. You think you can sanitize it to be public, you just can't. And then there's the people, candidly, who do just the cray-cray stuff. And you have people that just go around the bend with their cameras, and you end up with like the Pensacola case. And again, I don't want to, slam people, but you're doing the selfie war on the ambulance and trying to see who can come up with the worst or, most provocative or most negative. I'm not sure what the right term is for the way that they were judging their horrible selfies with patients. But at the end of the day, like, if you get to the point of taking regular pictures of your patients like that, you've really, you've gone to an entirely different level of normalization of deviance in social media.
I do like what you said about recruiting, though, because I've used social media to recruit too, for nurses, for medics. Like, hey, I have this many open positions at, this ER or that ER. Come work with us. And then other people were like, oh yeah, it's a great place to work. You should come work with us. And it really gets that knowledge of our department out, and it gets people excited. And I have recruited people from doing that. So that's a positive thing. But
my firm has done that for clients, for people who come to us to recruit management positions and they had a hard time and they're using Indeed and Ladders. And I'm like, you're not going to get good people on Indeed and Ladders and EMS. And I posted it on 3 Facebook groups and had 8 applicants by the end of the day. And my client called me up and like, how did you do that? And I'm like, social media. And they're like, so yeah.
Now, I wanted to kind of circle back to those, you kind of mentioned about people posting about calls and something else. So I wanted to kind of touch about the things that we see on calls. Sometimes we go home and we share with our family members, and it's important to have those conversations, and whether that's right or not, that's a whole nother conversation. But I want to share a story, and I have permission to share this story. My good friend, Chief Greg Yost, is a fire chief, and we were in Myrtle Beach, and we were at a conference. He had his phone off, and he left the conference, and I was staying an extra day. He got to the airport, and when he turned his phone on at the airport, all over Facebook was, I'm so sorry to hear about your daughter being killed. So he hadn't even, been told yet that his daughter had been killed, but she had been in a head-on collision, and his own fire department responded, and they went home and told their loved ones and so they all started to say prayers for this family. It wasn't, their intent was not to break HIPAA, to do anything out of, to be mean, but they were all trying to pray and things like that, thinking that the family had been notified. But here Greg was, in another state, and not with his family when he found out that his daughter had been killed. So I think that it's important that, we have the conversation with our EMS professionals, our firefighters, to take that conversation beyond that. And one of the things that I always suggest is to have a family night, bring those significant others into the fire EMS station, offer them pizza and say, hey, while you're here, you may hear things, and this is why you shouldn't share that. So I and I didn't know what advice that you had for those situations.
There's a number of those cases that have come up. That's not an isolated case.
No.
Where they've come up is people taking photographs of the cars or some other incident,
Exactly it.
posting on social media. They get out and the family either sees those photographs or a family friend sees the photographs and starts making those calls, and nobody has gone through that official route to approach the family. And in most of those cases, the employee who has posted those pictures has been terminated.
Yeah, Chip, it's funny. I use an illustrative case in my social media class. It's exactly that story out of Georgia, where they were taking pictures and they got back to the family members through back channels. It's interesting, Candace, you're talking about the notifications, and I think the answer is awareness. I was watching a TV show, and I'm not going to plug TV shows, because I am actually not a big TV watcher. I don't binge watch. But for some reason, I caught the episodes of a TV show called 68 Whiskey that's about combat medics in the Afghanistan-Iraq theater. And it's dramatized, and it's designed to be creative and colorful. But there's an episode where one of their colleagues is killed, and they do what I think they called River City is the protocol for RC, which is radio control. Because what they do is they shut down all of the internal communications out of the base to the rest of the world. And they come in and they're like, hey, you're on a phone call right now, click, and they shut them off until the families have all been notified. Because they know the support networks that people have, just like in EMS and fire service and law enforcement, where people tend to share information, and it's a big support network, but they know that it goes back around through the support network, and people are being notified of tragic events, just like your colleague, before it went through the front channels. And everybody there gets a little miffed that they're not able to talk to their family back in the States the way they want to. But they all understand, because but for the grace of God goes thee, any one of us at any time, knock on wood, could have something like that happen. So I think, Candace, to your point, that becomes an awareness thing. And I think people have to go and put themselves in that situation. I think a good written, just to start as a lawyer, Chip's going to punch me if I don't say this. I never, ever, ever do these things. And we seem to have lost Chip, so he's not going to. But you don't do any of this without a good written policy. Like, your policies have to drive the bus on this. But then you have to do this, and you have to sell them on the policy. And the way to sell people on these policies is tell them why. Tell a story. And Candace, your story is tragic, but it's compelling. Hey, look, imagine it's you and your kid gets killed in a head-on accident, and you find out by looking up your phone and go, holy crap, is that real? Compared to, and he's back. You're telling would you imagine how you'd feel if that was you? And that empathetic piece, I think, really resonates for how you do that. I think all of these things, but Simon Sinek's Start With Why is one of my favorite books. And if you explain to people the why, people talk about millennials needing to know why for things. It's not just millennials. My 11-year-old wants to know why. I'm 50. I want to know why. I think I'm just an angry person, honestly, but.
I agree, and that's what I had asked Chief Yost if I was able to share that story, because I think it is that emotional hook to make people realize that how something that was so innocent became so painful.
That's horrible.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next question that I had for you, and is, what should social media policies include?
Oh, everything. Honestly, you know what? I'm going to do this, and I'm going to pimp Chip and I here for a second. Is the first thing they should include is a lawyer, okay? Because you need to make sure this isn't easy stuff. And there's National Labor Relations Board concerted protected activity considerations. There's First Amendment considerations, or maybe there's not First Amendment considerations, depending on who your employer is. And the answer for this is, don't just write it with a lawyer, so they know what you're getting and getting right. They know what the case law is. They know what the federal case law is, and they know what the local case law is in your jurisdiction. Because Dr. Google and Google Esquire are your friend to a certain point, but what you see on the internet isn't always the right thing. And then the other thing I would just want to say on the policies, my firm, we have policies. We happily share those. Honestly, our social media policies we share as a matter of course with people as a public benefit, to be honest with you. But the important thing is to write them in English. And I want to give credit, my partner, Margaret Keaveney of the Keaveney and Strieger fame. My partner wrote our social media policy some years ago, and it is still the best policy that we've ever come up with in our firm. And the reason is she wrote it in English. It's not written in lawyerese. It's not written in thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that. It's like, you should do this. If you don't do that, this is the bad stuff that might happen. And people can read that. The average, 16-year-old kid who's a cadet on your first aid squad who overshares everything because that's their nature is, mother's milk and sharing information on social media. They live with that stuff. And they don't think anything of going on a call and talking about it. And for us to say, hey, here's your written policy, here's the expectations, but it's in your language and you should understand the reason why we're doing this, that's where you have to go with the policies. I can list otherwise the litany of things the policy should include, but honestly, we'll take up the whole rest of the podcast doing that, so I'm not going to do that. Jim?
One other thing I wanted to mention, because we were talking about speech versus pictures. So photographs don't have the same First Amendment protection that does speech, where you're conveying ideas. But one other implication on photographs is if you're out taking photographs on an incident scene, who owns those? If you're being paid particularly as a public employee where you are subject to public records laws, it may very well be that is a public record because you're taking it, again, documenting the activities of the office or of the political subdivision, and a destruction of that may be subject the employee to a fine or the department to a fine. There could be all sorts of issues about that. So if we're talking about social media and people taking photographs, I think you have to tie like a digital imagery policy into the social media policies, particularly addressing photographs taken on the job. And quite frankly, I think it's sort of a culture. We talked about there's no good reason to take your phone out and take a photograph unless it's clearly for the business. And I think that's the sense that with respect to photographs, if you're out on the scene, should never take them. Unless
and just for a second, David, to your point, a lot of places have passed laws right now that say, unless you're a member of the media, doing that in New Jersey, that's a crime. It's a fourth-degree crime in the state of New Jersey, and a lot of places have passed laws of that just for that point. And just one other moment, then I'll pass the baton here is, a lot of times you may be taking pictures of a crime scene, making your phone evidence. So, somebody catches that and they're like, hey, you're a pretty iPhone 11, by the way. We'd love to see all of your pictures and all of your video. And we're going to take a quick look at that right now. So anybody here on this call, anybody here who's watching this podcast, who's totally okay with handing your unlocked phone to any random stranger and letting them look at all your pictures, all your videos, and all your texts, see me after the class. Everybody else are the normal people. I'm not sure you're okay doing that.
I know of an incident where a county sheriff pulled up and the guy, the firefighters and EMS people had taken some photographs and he seized all of their cameras or all their phones.
Yeah. GoPros are the same thing. I have a lot of people that put the GoPro on their helmet at fire scenes, and I'm like, every fire scene is a crime scene potentially. Just saying. Anyway, sorry, Robin.
And they forget to turn those off. This was a case that was on the East Coast that a person went into a house. I forget what the incident was, but it turns out that person was an undercover police officer. Word got out. Inside of his house was filmed. They ended up suing the fire department and the employee. The fire department and insurance company said that employee was not authorized to do that. The employee handed it over to his own insurance company, said, I need to have you cover me. And they said, sorry, that rises out of the course of your employment. That's not covered. So the employee was out just hanging out there and, shouldn't have been filming in the first place.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where you're going with this, so I'm just going to kind of pass the baton because Rich has been here really quiet. And there's another piece of the social media, which is the other things where people pose and they do silly things on scenes. And one of those that was really egregious that we had talked about was down in Rich's neck of the woods, and it wasn't his by any means, but he's proximal to that. So I don't know if Rich wants to talk about those kind of like pose scenes and the optics of the way things like that go on. If Candace, is that?
Yeah, let's introduce Rich real quick. Yeah, no, I wanted to introduce Rich. So, our last guest that we're introducing is Richard Huff. He's an EMT and journalist. He's a leader in the EMS industry. He was actually one of the GEMS EMS 10 innovators in 2019. He's got an extensive background in teaching in the area of EMS and in communications. And I have to say this because I think this is where all the young people and the social media people that are true users are going to be really jealous. Rich has a verified Twitter account. Not many people can say that. So, and he takes some of the best photos ever. So Rich, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm going to be a little different here. My sense is if you're calling either one of these guys, you've not done your work.
Yeah.
You know, once I have to pull out a policy to say why somebody did something wrong, it's game over. You know, we talked in early March in EMS at EMS Today. And at that point, there weren't a lot of folks getting fired on a regular basis because of social media. And then in the past few months, as we've had protests and things going on around the country, it was like every other day, somebody in EMS went down because of something silly they posted. And a lot of that is because maybe it wasn't instilled in the culture of the agency or the organization to start with. And I may be naive in this, in terms of this area here, but I believe that starts at home. And it means at home at your agency, you have to let folks know that what they're doing is going to have larger implications. That tweet that you think is going out on your personal account, which is, but if you're out on an ambulance and tweeting at that point, well, now you've dragged me into it. Or your agency into it. And by then it's too late. So, you know, the policy is not going to help you there. I mean, there was a case in Massachusetts where an EMT tweeted something about get in front of my ambulance and I'm protecting my partner. They had to apologize for that. There was somebody in Jersey that got fired or dropped from a local health board because of something they tweeted about putting their their knee on somebody's neck. So, you know, these are dumb things. And part of it is there's no friction in social media, meaning I can get on Twitter right now and in a matter of 30 seconds compose a tweet that will ruin my life, ruin my agency's life, ruin my family's life. And there's nothing that holds you back there. I often fall back on advice that comes from Blue's Clues. Stop, breathe, think. And so many times I see stuff, I'm like, if you only thought, and it's not unlike being on an EMS call. How many times have you been on an EMS call where if maybe you spent 30 more seconds on the scene, you would have got a piece of information that would have changed something. And many times it's just, if you had spent 30 seconds or 3 minutes tweeting and saying it before you tweet and say, am I putting something out in the world that has some value? And we have to sort of think about why people are on social media. You know, they're trying to bring some value or entertainment to others. They're trying to prove their worth in some ways, self-fulfillment in some ways. And sometimes this gets in the way. So I think you really have to instill in your members that doing this, even on your own time, can have some blowback on us. And one more point on that is we see this now in law enforcement right now, where issues are going on around the country, and what happens in Kenosha has an impact in New Jersey or in Ohio, you know, all over the place, where so an EMT who may do something silly on social media in some small town somewhere in the world, it then becomes a stain on all of us in this field.
So you touched on two things that I wanted to circle back to. One, you talked about it starts at home, and I'm a true believer that instead of just having people sign policies, that we should educate them. Here's the policy. Let's go over what this means, and do you have any questions? Because we are all raised with different morals and values. So it's up to us as leaders in the industry and our own organizations to take the time to educate people on those, and not just to do it once when they onboard, because we know when we onboard we get all this paperwork, but to do it every single year and to do that refresher and to sit down with folks. And then, the other thing that you talked about is the why people use social media. And what I've learned through some of the research and working across generations is that what we know is that for many of us, especially in all of that's on this podcast, is that we grew up in an era where we told stories through words, where our younger generation, they tell stories through pictures. And so, they're used to just sharing their pictures in real time. So that's when we have to figure out, how do we meet in the middle and how do we make social media work, which goes into where I want to drive this conversation next. Let's talk about the positive social media, this positive of social media. And how do you think, Rich, can social media be used to leverage community support, recruitment, retention, and all of the good stuff?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of ways. You mentioned recruitment. Now, a lot of agencies like ours, we're a small volunteer organization in New Jersey. We do a lot of recruitment at public events, every car fair, art show, that sort of thing around. Well, nobody's having those this year. So now we have to be a little more aggressive on social media and appealing to folks to get them to at least inquire about being members that way, because your public approach has been taken away a little. So it's really great for that. Situational awareness. We're talking on a day where a hurricane hit the southern part of the country. There are people who are using that for situational awareness to see what's going on in their world. There are people who are reaching out to emergency agencies that way. We've seen that in California during the fires recently. So, that's another benefit for this. So it is a communications tool for a part of our population, not the entire population, but a significant part right now, as you pointed out right from the start of this, how many people are using social media. You have to be there, and you have to be there before you really need it, before the crisis, before the issue. You have to be on social media, and it's a great way, to build that awareness and value in your community long before you need your community to help you.
Great points, all great points. So, we talked about social media and using it in times of disaster. We see a lot of agencies that'll post things, hey, avoid this area, to help mitigate traffic during bad accidents or fires or things like that. So that's something else that we've seen. And then, we talked about recruitment and then social media for retention. It's really great when departments highlight their members. It also, kind of boosts the morale of the member. But then what do we see happen? Then their mom, their dad, their loved ones share that post that the organization posted and says, look how proud I am of my daughter or my son. And then it's an instant recruitment campaign.
Yeah, earlier this year, we rolled out some of those member profiles where we had a small survey and we had some nice photos. And they got some of our the largest levels of engagement, and they were shared, just as you point out. And that helps with employee morale as well. That helps them see themselves out in the world, and their family sees them out in the world. And all of those things add up in terms of building goodwill for an agency internally and externally. We can't forget, the internal portion of this, right? What's our message? We want the internal folks to know about what we're doing externally as well.
So the other thing that I always encourage departments and organizations to do is to have that balance. We know that our younger generation is so eager to share what they're doing, especially in the volunteer world. You get that first shirt, you're representing the department, and so you're proud to wear it and you want to share that message. So allowing them some photos to be able to share, having a point person in your organization that you could run those photos by, hey, we took photos of training tonight, can I share this? So I always thought it was a good practice to have a balance, and I don't know what tips that you have for folks on that.
I say have a buddy system. If you're getting ready to post something, show one other person and get their advice. It's not going to solve every problem, but very often if you show something to somebody else, and they may hesitate, or they may see something you don't see. You mentioned earlier, it's like, is there a cup in the scene? And And the other thing to think about anything on social media, and especially we talked earlier about, you sending it to a friend. Well, they might be your friend today, but they're not tomorrow. And that stuff does live forever. So have a buddy system. And again, build in the awareness early on about the impact of something even on their personal side has. If they're putting posts on their Facebook page and they happen to be wearing a squad shirt, but they're full of red Solo cups, well, that's going to send a certain image that may not work. And the key is, one of the other things we have to remember is that anything you post on social media can be used by the media. And not just on your personal, on your agency stuff, which is a whole other issue, but on your personal page. If you get pulled over for DWI and a reporter gets a hold of that, they're going to start going to all your social pages. And if they see a picture, I think Matt mentioned early on, and you've got your squad gear on, well, suddenly it's not just John Doe was pulled over for DWI. It was a member of Agency X was pulled over. So the implications there are huge. So I think it's a matter of awareness on what could happen. And so much that goes out doesn't need to go out. It just, show somebody a buddy system. Does this picture make sense? Can somebody take this the wrong way? Because so many times you see, what you thought was a great picture of you and your friends. Matt mentioned there was a scene. There was a huge fire not far from where I am on a boardwalk that in Asbury Park or Ocean Grove, I think it was, and it burned down a historic building. And a bunch of firefighters posed with the flames in the background. And that picture went viral because people were like, here are these firefighters laughing while a fire burns behind them. Well, the fire was being fought by other folks, but you don't get to be over somebody's shoulder and explain what's going on there. You might seem right to you, but you're not over their shoulder explaining, well, no, this is what really was happening. This was during a break or something. And we live in a period where it's this instant moment without context. So you don't have time to explain things.
Do you think it's important for leaders to engage in social media?
Oh, absolutely. I think you have to be on there. Now, you don't have to be the most active member of your organization, but I do believe that leaders need to be on there, partly because I think it's important to monitor as well. If you're in social media, one of the keys is monitor, monitor, monitor. So, you've got Google Alerts set up for when somebody mentions your agency. You've got, you've got TweetDeck up and you're following multiple accounts that maybe will mention your agency. So I think it's important to be on there and to have a presence and have your voice out there, especially if you get into a scenario where you've got a disaster or a storm coming or something. You build yourself into a trusted source of information.
Very good. Thank you.
So I think what we'd like to do is kind of circle back to each of you and see if you guys had any last words of wisdom for our listeners. So Chip, I'll start with you.
I'm going to go back to you. You were on the good trend of social media. I was going to add one last warning on the bad or ugly side. And I say this only because people don't think about this. Despite all of our best efforts and putting out all the good press that we do, there's always going to be somebody out there in the community that wants to paint the negative side and comment on that Facebook post that you put on there. And I have seen some people, some departments say, well, we don't want that because that's negative. And so the first reaction, particularly of the unexperienced or inexperienced social media coordinator, is to delete that post. And if we are a governmental entity, we are now censoring those negative posts. We're now violating that person in the public's First Amendment rights. So we've talked about First Amendment rights of our employees. We also have to understand, for good or bad, that the public has a right to comment as well. The decision in advance that they're going to not have their social media pages interactive, that they'll post, but they're not going to let people comment. And there are other things that need to be addressed. And again, we don't have that much time to do that, but I throw that out there since this is about social media and its use, that you need to also plan for, what happens when things don't go particularly well on your social media pages.
Chip, I think that's great advice. I don't think most people think, oh, I'm just going to delete that. I don't want that conversation going on my department page. But I think what you just said is something that a lot of people don't think about, that as a government entity, by removing that, you're censoring, the public. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being on the podcast. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So next we're going to move on to Matt, and we'll let him offer his last words of wisdom.
So I love Rich's comment about friction. And Rich, when we had spoken down in Florida, Rich used that comment about putting friction on and finding a way to slow things down. And I think it is absolutely the best advice anybody's have. I have, and it kind of ties into a concept. And Ray Barashansky was supposed to be on our panel down there, and he couldn't make it because it was right at the beginning phases of COVID. But Ray espouses this personal board of directors concept, the people that are in your life that you'll look at and you go, hey, and Ray and I do this regularly with each other, where I'm like, hey, is this post okay? And he'll be like, yeah, that's cool. Or say this a little differently. And it's usually, because we're pretty tuned in and not doing things that are crazy, but it's usually steer this way, say that, change that word. It's little subtle things that can be the difference between people appreciating what you're saying or being offended by what you're saying. And it's often the unintended consequences that do that. But my last piece of social media, use the board of directors, use the heck out of it. But for me, I think, and again, I love social media and I'm active on it, but I love the quote of it, only talk when it improves the silence, which I go up from the book Hardball by Chris Matthews, but I think it's actually a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, believe it or not. I think less is more on social media to a point, especially when you're talking about your personal social media presence and your brand, and when you're talking about your organization and what you want to do. And if you're on that bubble of like, hey, do I want to do this or not? Maybe you should err on not putting it up there. If you've got to think that much about it, the answer is probably no. That's not the place or not the time for it. We post things because, it's a great line from The Simpsons, old man shouts at cloud. It's Grandpa Simpson yelling. We like to shout at the clouds a lot. I'm not sure we change anybody's mind by social media. I've never seen anybody who in the history of social media was particularly polarized on any issue. It can be an EMS related issue, it could be a political issue. There's a ton right now, as we sit here today, of politically fraught issues that are being dealt with on social media. And I don't not support any of them, but I'm also not going to change your mind for my social media post. No one who is pro Black Lives Matter is going to read an anti-BLM post and be like, oh yeah, that's it. You know what? You're right. I had this whole thing wrong. And just extrapolate that to whatever political issue you'd like to, because it just doesn't happen. So it's a little bit of an echo chamber. It's a little bit of self-reinforcement. And I wonder sometimes what the purpose of that is to ourselves. I like to reinforce it. It's good. I'm good. We're good. Okay. I'm not sure that it's serving the public discourse in any way. So think about what you're saying, why you're saying it, and have somebody check that stuff. And at the end of the day, if you're teetering there, maybe you should fall off on the side of not doing it.
That's great advice. I think that's good advice. My mom used to always tell me, if you're having doubts, don't do it. Listen to that inner voice. So it's usually a good sign. So that is great advice. And thank you so much for sharing tonight and being a part of our podcast. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, please.
All right, so now we're going to move on to our final guest, Rich, for his words of wisdom. So we'll see what he has to share with everybody as we finish things up today.
Well, I think it's important that agencies be on social media. The bottom line, despite some of the negative aspects we've discussed here, you have to be there. That is one tool that is being used by a portion of your communities right now. So you have to be there. To Matt's point, I think, judge how much you actually need to be on there. I also suggest too, that agencies have a team involved here, not just one person, which sometimes it falls on. It's one person. If that person goes on vacation and something bad happens, and we've got a real problem. But if you have a team involved, one, you're working on the voice together. Two, you have that buddy system that I mentioned earlier, that we create some friction, that we're not just posting willy-nilly. I'm with Matt on the camp of not posting specific call stuff. I see the clickbait that's involved there, but I really think, photos of fires and that sort of stuff. There are some agencies that it seems like every time they roll, they've got a camera going too. I think that is, you're preying and making clickbait out of somebody's disaster. So have a team, friction, and you need to be there.
Awesome. Well, we want to thank you guys again for being on our show tonight. I am Robin Goldinger.
And I am Dr. Candace McDonald. Thank you for listening to Another Dose. Until next time.